So I blame Jeff for me being up here. Oh, wait, there's Jeff, he's back. So OpenPOWER Foundation recently set up a charter for a new work group. That's the Accelerated Application Ecosystem Work Group. Say that 3 times really fast and I'll probably get dizzy. The whole point of this is to look at all the things like GPUs, FPGAs, OpenCAPI, et cetera, that's coming along, and figuring out how to translate all this cool hardware stuff into stuff that software folks can understand. There is a lot of documentation on some of this, but there aren't a lot of libraries and that sort of thing. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the goals are as we go through here, but that's kind of the very high-level presentation to get started. We are newly charted. One of the goals will be to, of course, identify which accelerators are in scope. The answer at the moment is everything that's not on the core, more or less. So that's a lot of stuff potentially. We are trying to look to connect with some ISVs on this. There are a few ISVs that have actually done some software development around accelerators. There are more universities probably that have done work there. But the goal is to broaden that entire ecosystem and pull in the ISVs. So the goal is to connect them to the knowledge that they need to have. We obviously need to understand a few things about the existing accelerators, like are there common patterns in what the accelerators do? Are there common libraries that should be used, that sort of thing. We need to know what porting resources there are. And the kind of stage 2 is to actually generate an ISV survey process. I'll tell you that the group that's formed on this didn't really want to spend any time on the chartering work or on the survey process. They just wanted to get to work and fix the problem. But we're trying to stay a little bit ordered here, and I think it's going to be for the better in the long term. So, this will be short. I do have one story. I don't know if any of you remember or have heard of the VAX 11780. I used to work at Purdue University, and our hardware guys opened up the cover one day and said, boy, there's a lot of extra wires in here. I think we could put a sidecar on. Maybe like another processor even. In fact, maybe we've got a processor here from one of our other machines that died. Let's see if we can wire it in. They did the wiring in. I did the software for a lot of that, the first BSD version to support SMP, actually. And it's probably not a lot different than adding GPUs and FPGAs today. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a while. Look at all these extra wires, pins on the socket, whatever it might be. It's a little different, but I've been doing stuff like this for a long time, both as a driver person and a few other things. Also as one of the architects for the Linux, for the LTC, and one of the architects when IBM started to get involved in cloud. So I've been around a block or two. Just got, I said, who wants to be the next chair for this work group? Everybody else jumped back from the phone, and so I was left holding the mic. So you get to hear from me about some of this. This is not my forte, though, in the common sense of the OpenPOWER accelerators right now. So I'm coming up to speed. We've got some really good people that are involved on our work group. They've got a lot more awareness of some of the CAPI, OpenCAPI work that's going on, some of the FPGA work. So this is going to be a synthesis of some of the experts along with some of the things that I do or can bring to the team. This is, and I'm going to show you a few of these slides are just kind of taken out of our chartering documents and that sort of thing. So there's nothing too fancy in here. But we are basically going to try to collect all the information that relates to accelerators, put it somewhere where you can get a fingertip guide to it if you're a developer, and provide as much as we can in terms of resources to enable people to make use of these accelerators. They're pretty clearly, I think if you're here at this summit in general, you've heard OpenCAPI, you've heard accelerators, FPGA, GPU. It's definitely the big wave here. It is, I think the way I saw it presented is it's the way to get past von Neumann's kind of limitations on the infrastructure out there today. So I think this is actually going to be very valuable. There's a bunch of steps, and this is a laundry list. I don't want to read a laundry list to you. I'll leave it out there. But one of the big initial steps is to put together this ISV survey. And there's a lot of questions that have come up on our working group so far about what ISVs need to know. There's some that are very technical, like what is the OpenCAPI spec, where do I get hardware, what types of APIs would I need to use. There's some that have come up that are a lot what I'll call softer or on the marketing side, like why would I want to use an accelerator? What markets might I be after if I'm using an accelerator? What workloads would actually run better if I were using an accelerator? So we're going to try to get into some of those questions and kind of I'll say a little bit of higher level view of how to address some of those. One of the goals here is to put together this survey, and I'll show you kind of a preview of it that we've got started. But we'd like to have a few ISVs participating with us in generating the questionnaire. So we've got actual detailed insights from people that are actually trying to do this. But then we want to be able to go out and we're going to look for references for key ISVs that could go answer this with us, probably in a sit-down session where we can say, here are the kind of questions we're working through. What's your take on this? What do you need? Try to get real customer-driven input about what needs to happen here for the accelerated applications. There's a bunch of stuff in here, summarize, disposition, prioritize the requirements. Jeff has made it very clear that we need to share our findings perhaps more broadly within the OpenPOWER Foundation as we generate them. So if somebody says, yeah, all this accelerator stuff is great, you got everything on OpenCAPI 3.0, but I can't find anything about FPGAs, then we're going to prioritize around FPGAs, right? We're going to get that input and actually make decisions there. We might take some of it back to other working groups within the OpenPOWER Foundation. So if the OpenCAPI group is doing a bunch of work, maybe we'll just say, here's what we learned from the ISVs. You might want to figure out how to handle this. Or we might find out that it's really a software issue, or maybe there's an open source community we need to interlock with and see if we can bring some things on board. So it's kind of open, up in the air at the moment as to exactly how we get to our end goal, but our end goal is pretty clear, right? We want to get a lot of input on how to get there. And I think we've got some of the right people participating to help with that. That's probably good enough there. So I just mentioned we might be working with other working groups. There's a subset of the ones we expect we'll be working with. A lot of those I think are represented here. I'm actually joining some of those other working groups right now as an observer to try to pull data from them to be able to kind of collect and collate information that we might need. But that's kind of the high level goal there. Our working group today is small. We get quorum most of the time. We're working on building that out. But we are looking for people, individuals that are active in some of the other working groups to help cross-pollinate. We are looking for members who are looking to broaden the ecosystem, maybe to help sell product, help bring ISVs on board for their own custom hardware. We are looking most of all for ISVs, right? That's going to be where the prime input is, and that's going to be the prime measure of our success over time, is how many software applications we can bring to the accelerated ecosystem. And then we've got also the whole open source community side, and that's where I've got some tie-ins today as well. How to get them some of the information, how to get them maybe access to hardware so that they can do test and development. Maybe figuring out which libraries may need some interfaces put in or some standardization of interfaces, that sort of thing. So our primary deliverable is this questionnaire, which I've already talked about. I'm expecting also one of our big deliverables will be one place to go, one place to find information. At worst case, it's one of those sites that you go to that just has links to 1,000 other places. At least it's all in one. I'm hoping it's going to be a lot better than that. I'm going to show you at the end of this another project that I've worked on that's similar. There's some overlap, but I'll show you kind of what we did there, building up the power ecosystem, not specific to accelerators. We're going to do a working list of the identified requirements. So we're going to synthesize all the input from our ISVs into what is hopefully a prioritized list, some clear direction on what we need to do to make this ecosystem better overall. And there's a chance that we might identify other working groups that need to be chartered. We have one very vocal member that's very interested in the on-chip optimization, some of the special instructions that are out there and how they're not very well documented compared to what Intel does. That's actually at the moment outside of scope. I'll talk to that in just a moment a little bit more, but that might be something that we want to do separately from what we're doing in this working group. So this is almost a repeat, but it's again, this is the kind of the activities that we'll be doing in kind of a in order sort of flow. So we're doing right now the definitions and trying to plan what the interview is going to look like. We're going to then look for ISVs. So if you are an ISV in this room, I would love to talk to you after this session. If you know of an ISV, please connect them to myself or to Jeff or somebody on the technical steering committee, and we'll get them brought in, because we definitely want to get that kind of input. And then we want to summarize all of that, and we're, instead of is-positioning, we're going to disposition the ISV input. And then, of course, we're going to publicize and share what we find. So that we are actually Jeff, correct me here, we're a public work group? What's our public work group?
You are a public working group.
So we can share the outcome of most everything that we generate.
And I believe non-confidential as well. So.
Cool. I got to keep that in mind too. Good. Because we will get some input occasionally from people like ISVs that we'll have to be clear that whatever they're giving us is non-confidential, that we'll be able to share it or aggregate it. So topics in scope, development libraries, hardware API development. You know, I can envision, this has happened in the past when I was part of the kernel community, that the hardware APIs might really stink from a software developer perspective. So there may be some feedback back and forth between the two on how to clean up, simplify, make things more accessible. There's obviously some documentation. I've, in the past week, seen more documentation than I know what to do with. And if I were an ISV, I wouldn't even know where to start on some of it because it's copious but not focused on developer needs at the moment. It's exploiting everything about the hardware or OpenCAPI, but not what do I need to do my day job. So we'll try to do some reduction of that. And then there may also be, you know, this I kind of just threw in there because of past experience, but there may be some configuration constraints on some of these accelerators. You know, maybe you can only have 3 FPGAs on a system, or you can't do an FPGA on the same something as some other GPU. You know, what these things that people need to do, or people need to know when they're configuring the hardware that are not the typical things that an ISV would have to think about. And those are just examples. For accelerators in scope, this is kind of a list that we pulled together. There's probably more, and if I've left stuff out, feel free to tell me. We aren't so smart to think we got them all, right? We're always willing to get more input there. There is a big category at the bottom where we all see things about accelerated storage, network, and memory technologies. That could be a large set of things. You know, we're still kind of exploring the bounds of that. I saw some more at the keynotes this morning that I hadn't heard of prior. And I'm sure that there will be more of that over time. Here's the stuff I referred earlier as kind of out of scope. We're not going to go into things like the on-chip NX accelerators and some of the specialized instructions out there. So we're putting it up so it's clearly not the stuff that we're working on, just to be clear on that. So to give you an idea as to what we're going to ask the ISVs, and don't laugh if you see a silly question. Just tell me how to fix it. Well, you can laugh because I might laugh with you. But there are some classes of ISVs that we've already identified. There's those who have already ported an application to x86 or developed an application probably on x86. They're using an accelerator like an FPGA or a GPU, and they want to bring that over to Power. One of the things we realized when thinking about the questionnaire is if they've got an existing application, we could run some basic tools over it, like LDD, and find all the symbols that they're using, find out which libraries they're using. We could get some insight to help figure out if all those things are available on Power or not, or what the big gaps are. So a porting environment is probably easier to deal with than somebody that's actually starting new development on Power to use an accelerator. We've got some generic questions about frameworks or programming models. You know, a lot of people are talking about the Arrow framework, for instance, and what it's been enabled to do. And there are a lot of instantiations of the Arrow family, I guess, like PyArrow is the Python primary connector there. And I think I've got a list of those, yeah, right here. So the OpenACC, the CUDA environment, OpenMP, OpenMPI, Apache Arrow. And there's going to be a series of those. We're still trying to put that list together. Again, we're taking input on that list. Some of those may never be accelerated. Some of those may just intrinsically wind up having to be accelerated. I kind of mentioned this. What markets would you be able to extend into if you had hardware acceleration? For instance, if you're in the banking industry but you want to go into Wall Street, maybe a little tweak here with some acceleration allows you to get into some of the workloads there. Or maybe you're in one of the labs and you want to go into something in deeper HPC or research. And we try to understand what markets people are after and why they would actually even want to pick up an accelerator. Hard question to ask or answer, but what impact would this have on your market share? For instance, is somebody going after a market that's, tiny and they'd get access to the whole thing? Or is it a huge market that they're just going to wind up opening up with new accelerators and maybe there's going to be a whole bunch of players that want to get in? So we're going to try and understand where some of that's coming from. Jeff?
So observation, some of this information is going to be awfully sensitive
Yep.
to customers.
Absolutely.
So you are given your work group charter, that may be something we have to think about carefully.
Yeah, I'm.
And you may not be able to, they may not be willing to share it. So
Yeah.
I get the point.
Yeah, and that's one, I think I highlighted earlier as being a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
And I've learned historically, and you'll find this amusing, I've learned this by working with lawyers, there's always a way to get to success. It may not be the straightforward one, and we'll have to figure out what that method is, but it is going to be a sensitive topic. There are a lot of sensitive topics throughout some of this. People doing an accelerator on an FPGA might be competing with somebody doing one with the GPU. Do we want to share information between ISVs there? Do they want to talk about what markets they're after, et cetera? So absolutely right. There is some potential sensitive information. We're putting it up here to kind of know what scope we would like to have. That doesn't mean we're going to get all of these scopes, right? You'll notice my bullet number is renumbered because I'm using the online PowerPoint, and I couldn't figure out how to fix that, but the numbers don't matter. What markets can you not address today that you could if you had accelerated OpenPOWER? What are your perceived technical inhibitors? So some of these questions are going to be more focused, some are going to be more essay questions. Because sometimes we don't know what question we should ask, but the ISV knows what statement they want to tell us, right? So we're going to be kind of prepared for that, and the essay questions might be a way to get there. What are your perceived business inhibitors? Could be anything. Could be from cost to easy availability. Could be open source libraries. Could be all kinds of stuff. Which accelerators has an individual ISV considered? So we told you which ones are in scope, but kind of curious which ISVs are planning to use which accelerators. Which software package do you know enable those accelerators? So there's some OpenCAPI stuff going on, some software side there, but is there much for FPGAs today? Some people say no, some people say not at all, some people say nothing. Okay, well, those are all the same, aren't they? I guess there isn't a lot today for open FPGAs, so we want to find out what the end user thinks is the case for some of these as well. They may have found a treasure trove from a university that was working on something, and maybe that's what we need to be working with. A little bit of, again, more on market segments. There's a lot of ways we've talked about it, and this will probably come down to one or two questions when we're all finished, but we're trying to think about this in kind of a holistic, what are we trying to solve and what things do we really need? So that's kind of the core of the contents. The goal is to get some input from the hardware acceleration manufacturers, so some of the people that are typically here today, in fact, what I've seen with the OpenPOWER Foundation is there's a heavy hardware-centric basis to the group today, right? And that's great for getting hardware documentation. That's not so great for the software people sometimes. But we still need that input. We need to know what they're building, how they're doing it, what the gaps are. But we also need input from the ISVs we talked about, both those that are using them and those that are thinking about using them. They're going to be two wildly different sets, those that have practical information versus those that have perceptions. And sometimes the perceptions are the rule when you're dealing, or the perceptions are the reality when you're dealing with something like this. If they think it's impossible, they'll treat it as impossible, and we have to change the perception. Input from performance teams using accelerators. So this all goes to the why would I use an accelerator? And I've already seen a bunch of, like even this morning, some charts about power benefits from hardware changes, from using some of the accelerators. I've seen a lot of stuff with OpenCAPI and the numbers, how much additional bandwidth you can get. Some of that needs to be wrapped up, I don't want to say in a marketing form. I'm not a marketing guy, and I never will be. Apologies to you, those of you who are. I'm a techie. I want to know, why would I do this? What's it going to make faster, right? Am I going to get a 20% boost over Intel? Am I going to get a 50% boost? Am I going to get a 10x boost? And that's where Chris Sullivan isn't here, is he today? I don't see him. Yeah, Chris does a really good job of this with GPUs and training of cognitive, and he's got numbers that show 10x performance on power, and it's like, wow, this is great. But we want to be able to have information like that when we're talking to ISVs and say, here's why you might want to be using this accelerator. A lot of the work today on the software side is being done by researchers. Obviously, we need to pick their brains and figure out what they're learning, because they're going to have some really good input there, both experiential and theoretical. And then obviously generate some priorities based on all of that. So, if we're successful, the next chart is a blue sky with I want to give you an example in a minute. Part of my role today inside of IBM is the Linux Power ecosystem. It didn't have the word accelerators in it until Jeff came along. But a lot of what we do is enabling ISVs to operate on Power. We do a lot of porting of open source applications. We look at this through the lens of cognitive or through cloud or through whatever else is going on. We've got a bunch of open source database work that we've been involved in. And how many of you were Power developers, users back before Little Endian? Anybody in here? How many of you can remember trying to find information back then about Power? A lot of blank looks. Oh, Jeff remembers, because he had it all at his fingertips, right? We did a bunch of work when I first took over this role, and we found something like 30 sites, probably 28 of which were hosted at IBM somewhere, 2 that weren't, that said, oh, you've come to the Power portal. This is where you will learn everything you need to know about Power. And each one of them had about 4 links, and maybe 1 blurb based on whichever group they were put out by. Finding information was a nightmare. Finding any of those on Google or your favorite search engine, you had to go to page 8 on Google. How many people ever go to page 8 on Google? Me neither. If it's not on page 1, or maybe page 2 if I'm desperate, it doesn't exist, right? So we spent a lot of time trying to bring and coalesce all of this information to a single spot. We tried to figure out what developers needed to know and get that information front and center. We think, based on the work we did there, we succeeded. We're actually doing a design thinking session with a bunch of our kind of key input people to figure out where to go with that next. I think from an IBM side, some of this acceleration work will actually go into there, but I don't think that's the answer for the vision of working group success here. I think that's a supplemental piece of information, but we'll work on that. One thing I can say is it should have all the collected documentation that's necessary for software developers. It should have kind of an ecosystem jump-off point. So it might point to university research work to say, here's the stuff that backs up the fact that this FPGA can give you a 10x improvement in this algorithm. Right, that's the kind of stuff people might want to be able to find easily. Examples, blogs, links to other documentation, that's always useful. If you're a developer, having a code snippet is sometimes worth gold. It's better than reading a 300-page document on how to program something. Right, that one little snippet can tell you everything you might need if you can find the right snippet. And basically just a one-stop shop for developers. So I wanted to queue up here. Let's see if I can do this. This is just kind of a walkthrough of a portal that we've done internally. And I don't know, I think I have the music shut off because it makes me want to go drinking or something. This is, if you're a Power developer, this is the portal today that we have out there, and shows you some of the things that are available that you might want to find if you're trying to do any kind of development on Power. So there's a top-level menu that gives you things like, technologies are grouped together, resources are grouped together. There's a package search capability. I see there potentially being some kind of an accelerator code snippet repository based on the output of this working group, things like that. Have any of you seen this package search tool or the portal at all? Anybody seen the portal? Just kind of out of curiosity. So a couple of you, not very many. This comes up pretty often now if you're doing Google searches on things related to power developers and that sort of thing. And we spent almost 4 years working on search engine optimization to be able to get that. So it's not something you get for free. The ability to advertise, get information out, and share it is difficult anymore. There's so much competing noise out there that getting any visibility for the people that need it to your project or your work is tough. This is actually one of our most visited, there's a name for them, developer portals, basically on our developer sites now, which is a huge step up from where it used to be. You can see some stuff that is technology-centric, so around cognitive or around CAP. We've already got some CAPI Snap stuff out there. You can see some OpenStack stuff. And I'm showing this not to just sell you on the portal, although if you want to use the portal, go for it. It's great. But this is more like, I'd like to see something like this focused on the accelerators, maybe centered at the OpenPOWER Foundation, so that members or even non-members can actually find access to the stuff that they need. So I'm going to let that run for another, I don't know if it's another minute, something like that. You can follow along or sip your coffee, whichever. I really like the other IBM resources that are up there. There's a lot of stuff that you just wouldn't think to go look for out there if you're looking for kind of a jumping off point for all kinds of resources. So while that's playing, that's I think almost finished. I'll say that's probably the end and ask if there are any questions. It looks like most of you are still awake. That's a record for me.
You're mentioning ISVs and focus on ISVs. Are you going to also look at open source applications and hints and tips that might fit under that application?
So yeah, that's in my blood. That's that whole open source connection, absolutely. And in fact, there are a number of places where I think that's going to be key. In my current role, one little tidbit, maybe you've all heard this already, but pretty much every application that's out there, commercial application that's out there, is built, approximately 80% of the application is based on open source, right? Whenever we get a request for an ISV or an application, the first question we've started asking them is, which open source do you depend on? And the answer is never, we don't. The answer is always, that's going to take a while to get to you because it's so much, right? And they have to figure out how it's all integrated. So absolutely. Is there any start in the marketplace on that today? Not very much, right? I think that's a place where some of the people, I think the OpenCAPI community from what I've seen might be a little bit ahead of the rest there. I think there's more tools and software available. I don't think I've seen much for FPGAs. GPUs is pretty much NVIDIA, which is pretty much their own ecosystem. So I don't see a lot of open source work there. Some of the others like SSDs and NVMe, accelerated networking technologies, I don't think there's a lot out there. So there's a lot of gaps, right, is my point. Are we going to be able to boil the ocean? Probably not. But I think the key is to first get that set of priorities from the ISVs about what needs to be looked at. And I'm sure open source will be on there. The goal will be to figure out which open source is the highest priority, right? That's how we will typically deal with it. It's a good question. Other questions?
Developers out there, they are playing with FPGAs, use accelerators, can contribute to your portal and get information that so that can be shared
Yeah, a lot of this stuff, almost everything anymore is about communities, right? And enabling those communities to provide a lot of that information that they themselves can share. And that's been hard in the OpenPOWER space. You know, you've worked on some of this, I've worked on some of this. We were talking earlier about Google, who supports everything, is having trouble supporting Power on Chromium, right? It should be obvious, but it's like building up that community, those individuals to understand that this might be valuable to them over time. I think that's going to be a how do we become successful question once we figure out what we need to do. And you're absolutely right. It's a hard problem. You know, I mentioned boiling the ocean earlier. We're doing that with open source software. You know, we talked about that with, I think, Abdul's session as well, the 300 to 600 Docker containers out of how many? Got a lot of ways to go. So, other questions? I've been flashed the 5-minute side, which means we still have 3 minutes if you've got questions.
I do want to make a comment on the code snippets, and I think there is a place for sample code snippets here. And you know, we have Anton who's got his famous sets of code snippets, and there are several of us thinking about that. So if you get to the point where code snippets, you know, I'm thinking some common GitHub repository for snippets of code somewhere, where people can, as you said, go get a piece of code and start hacking on it as a place to get started. I think that has value, and that's something we traditionally have not thought about from an IT perspective. Certainly the new way to write code.
And we have a bunch of plugins inside of modern IDs that suggest little code based on what we're doing. For instance, this is the function that they know that this function can be there. They suggest you to fix that based on common knowledge.
Yeah. So please, I'm encouraging you to think about code snippets, and when we, you know, that becomes key, and make sure we're asking that question. It's not just about documentation; it's about documentation in the form of existing code or sample code or framework code. Let's not lose that thought, and let's pursue that as far as we go.
So,
if you get down that path.
Okay, so Jeff, that was a great question. I've just taken some time to think about it. I think we have a solution. One thing that my team has been putting together for quite a while, on github.com there's a PPC64LE directory. I own it, but my team owns it. You know, we can all take and contribute stuff there. It's actually got, today, one of the things out there is build scripts for 500 projects or so. And they're the ones, if you're smart enough, you can go out to that open source project. Anybody could probably figure it out. There's a few that might have some dependencies satisfied in the scripts, but it turns it into a push return on the end of that bash script or whatever it is, and it will pull all the stuff together and build that project. We've also got a few other things at that location. It would be very easy today to start putting code snippets there and continue to advertise that as the place for now. And if it becomes wildly successful and overgrows GitHub, we'll figure out a new place. But there are a lot of simple solutions for a lot of these complex problems, and the goal is to have a clear vision of how to do them. And I think that's the kind of answer I'm a big fan of. Like, I'm going to steal all of Anton's and put them there. And I've been told at this point that we are done. Thank you all very much. It's been an exciting session.